My sisters received luxury gifts while I got a toothbrush, but when they found out I would inherit everything from our grandparents, their envy destroyed them. I'll never forget the Christmas when everything became crystal clear. I must have been about 10 years old. The December cold barely touched the warmth of our house, decked out with lights and decorations. My mom, as always, was glowing, orchestrating every detail of the dinner like a director at a symphony. My dad barked orders with the authority of a general. And my sisters? Oh, they were the stars of the show, dressed in brand new, expensive outfits, spinning around the Christmas tree to show them off. And me? I was told to just wear whatever you've got. But the worst part came when it was time for the gifts. See, I didn't have high expectations. I'd long learned to keep them low. My older sister unwrapped a shiny, top-of-the-line bicycle that probably cost a fortune. My younger sister got a state-of-the-art gaming console, complete with every accessory imaginable. And then it was my turn. My mom, with an awkward smile, handed me a small package. Inside was a toothbrush. Yes, a toothbrush. Not even an electric one. I remember looking at my parents, searching for some sign that this was a joke, that any second now they'd pull out a real present. But no, all I got was that awkward smile from my mom. My sisters burst into laughter, and my dad didn't even bother looking up from his plate. That night, sitting in my room holding that toothbrush, something clicked in me. No matter how hard I tried, no matter what I did, I would always be an afterthought in this family. It wasn't about money, they had plenty of that. My dad ran a successful business, and my mom spent her days making sure we looked like the perfect, happy family. Except that perfection never seemed to include me. At every family event, my sisters were the first to be introduced, the center of attention, while I stood quietly in the background, invisible. The only ones who noticed me were my grandparents. My grandparents. They were the only reason I didn't crumble under the weight of it all. Whenever I could, I spent weekends at their house. My grandmother would cook my favorite meals, and my grandfather would sit me down and teach me life skills. How to fix things, how to stay strong when the world seemed determined to knock me down. You're different, and that's a good thing, he'd often tell me. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but those words soothed something deep inside me. With every shared conversation and every small gesture of love, they tried to fill the void my parents and sisters left behind. They never openly said they noticed the injustice, but I could feel it. My grandmother would shoot sharp looks at my mom whenever she ignored me at family gatherings, and my grandfather, with his calm wisdom, would say things like, "Time has a way of putting everyone where they belong." Back then, I didn't grasp the full weight of that statement, but I held on to it. While my sisters basked in their undeserved privileges, I became the quiet observer, the one who noticed everything. I stopped expecting recognition from my parents. I stopped hoping for their approval. Instead, I poured all my attention into my grandparents, who treated me like I mattered, like I was someone worth noticing. Though I was the forgotten child, the bond with my grandparents became my anchor. They taught me that even when the world turns its back on you, there's a strength to be found in unexpected places. Little did I know then that their lessons would one day save me, and that the perfect little world my parents and sisters had built would come crashing down around them, and I would rise stronger than they could ever imagine. But on that Christmas night, I was just a kid with a cheap toothbrush and a heart full of hurt, unaware that everything was about to change. I'll never forget the Christmas when everything became crystal clear. I must have been about 10 years old. The December cold barely touched the warmth of our house, decked out with lights and decorations. My mom, as always, was glowing, orchestrating every detail of the dinner like a director at a symphony. My dad barked orders with the authority of a general. And my sisters? Oh, they were the stars of the show, dressed in brand new, expensive outfits, spinning around the Christmas tree to show them off. And me? I was told to just wear whatever you've got. But the worst part came when it was time for the gifts. See, I didn't have high expectations. I'd long learned to keep them low. My older sister unwrapped a shiny, top-of-the-line bicycle that probably cost a fortune. My younger sister got a state-of-the-art gaming console, complete with every accessory imaginable. And then it was my turn. My mom, with an awkward smile, handed me a small package. Inside was a toothbrush. Yes, a toothbrush. Not even an electric one. I remember looking at my parents, searching for some sign that this was a joke, that any second now they'd pull out a real present. But no, all I got was that awkward smile from my mom. My sisters burst into laughter, and my dad didn't even bother looking up from his plate. That night, sitting in my room holding that toothbrush, something clicked in me. No matter how hard I tried, no matter what I did, I would always be an afterthought in this family. It wasn't about money, they had plenty of that. My dad ran a successful business, and my mom spent her days making sure we looked like the perfect, happy family. Except that perfection never seemed to include me. At every family event, my sisters were the first to be introduced, the center of attention, while I stood quietly in the background, invisible. The only ones who noticed me were my grandparents. My grandparents. They were the only reason I didn't crumble under the weight of it all. Whenever I could, I spent weekends at their house. My grandmother would cook my favorite meals, and my grandfather would sit me down and teach me life skills. How to fix things, how to stay strong when the world seemed determined to knock me down. "You're different, and that's a good thing," he'd often tell me. I didn't fully understand what he meant, but those words soothed something deep inside me. With every shared conversation and every small gesture of love, they tried to fill the void my parents and sisters left behind. They never openly said they noticed the injustice, but I could feel it. My grandmother would shoot sharp looks at my mom whenever she ignored me at family gatherings, and my grandfather, with his calm wisdom, would say things like, "Time has a way of putting everyone where they belong." Back then, I didn't grasp the full weight of that statement, but I held on to it. While my sisters basked in their undeserved privileges, I became the quiet observer, the one who noticed everything. I stopped expecting recognition from my parents. I stopped hoping for their approval. Instead, I poured all my attention into my grandparents, who treated me like I mattered, like I was someone worth noticing. Though I was the forgotten child, the bond with my grandparents became my anchor. They taught me that even when the world turns its back on you, there's a strength to be found in unexpected places. Little did I know then that their lessons would one day save me, and that the perfect little world my parents and sisters had built would come crashing down around them, and I would rise stronger than they could ever imagine. But on that Christmas night, I was just a kid with a cheap toothbrush and a heart full of hurt, unaware that everything was about to change. Over the years, the feeling of being invisible in my own family became second nature. I learned not to expect anything, not to get my hopes up, not even for the smallest things. My sisters continued to be the center of attention, the household princesses, while I morphed into a shadow, someone whose existence only seemed to matter when it came to chores or following the house rules. The irony is that my parents weren't bad people. From the outside, they looked like the perfect family. My mom was always hosting events, ensuring everything was picture perfect. My dad, with his authoritative yet fair demeanor, focused on keeping up appearances. But beneath that facade was a favoritism so blatant it was impossible to ignore. Everything revolved around my sisters, and no matter how hard I tried to stand out or be part of their world, it was never enough. If I got good grades, it was barely acknowledged with a lukewarm "good job." If I achieved something noteworthy at school, it wasn't even mentioned at dinner. It was always about them, always. The only place I felt truly seen, heard, and valued was at my grandparents' house. They were my sanctuary, my escape from the suffocating reality at home. My grandfather had this way of talking that made you feel like you could conquer the world. He was a simple man but brimming with wisdom. "Don't ever let anyone tell you who you are or what you're worth," he'd say whenever he saw the sadness in my eyes. My grandmother, on the other hand, was pure warmth. She always knew how to lift my spirits, whether it was with one of her homemade meals or just a hug that seemed to hold all the love I was missing at home. It was during one of those visits that my grandfather spoke to me about the future for the first time. He took me to the garden, his favorite spot, and as he watered the plants, he said something I'd never forget. "Life has a funny way of balancing the scales. Sometimes it seems like some people have it all while others have nothing, but time has a way of settling the score." I didn't fully grasp his words then, but I held onto them like a treasure. Meanwhile, back home, everything followed the same pattern. My sisters got everything they wanted and more, Their birthdays were extravagant events with dozens of guests, lavish decorations, and gifts straight out of a luxury catalog. My birthdays? A family dinner at home if I was lucky, and a gift that, at best, was something practical and inexpensive. One year stood out. My younger sister got a brand new car for her 18th birthday, while at the same age, I received a pair of school shoes. The disparity was insulting, but by that point, I didn't even bother complaining. What was the point? Nothing would change. Little by little, I got used to being the invisible child. Instead of seeking their approval, I started focusing on what truly mattered to me. I poured myself into my studies, worked tirelessly to save money, and planned my future without relying on them. I learned to be self-sufficient, to depend on no one but myself. Deep down, I think my parents assumed I'd never amount to much, that I'd always live in the shadow of my sisters. But they had no idea I was quietly building something far greater than their shallow world of appearances. Still, one thing I couldn't ignore was my grandparents' relationship with my parents and sisters. While my grandparents tried their best to treat everyone equally, it was clear their patience with my parents was wearing thin. My grandfather, in particular, didn't hide his disappointment with how they treated me. I don't understand how anyone can be so blind to what's right in front of them. I once overheard him say, frustration evident in his voice, a rarity for him. What I didn't know then was that my grandparents were planning something that would change all of our lives forever. And when the moment came, the priorities of my family, their luxuries and privileges, would be thrown into question in a way none of us, not even I, could have anticipated. Things began to shift in subtle ways at first, barely noticeable, but looking back, the signs were always there. My grandparents, who had been the glue holding the family together, started to act more reserved toward my parents and sisters. Family gatherings, once filled with laughter and celebration, became increasingly tense. My grandfather grew quieter during conversations, and my grandmother, though still kind, began making comments that visibly unsettled my parents. I vividly remember one particular lunch. We were all seated around the large wooden dining table at my grandparents' house. It was one of those sunny days where everything seemed perfect from the outside, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. My mother was enthusiastically talking about my eldest sister's wedding plans, with my father chiming in every now and then with proud remarks. My sisters dominated the conversation as always, bragging about their lives, their friends, and the things they wanted to buy or do. As usual, I kept quiet, focusing on my plate. But then my grandfather couldn't hold back anymore. He set his fork down with a deliberate clink and, with a calmness that masked his frustration, said, "And what about you, son? How are your plans coming along?" All eyes turned to me, and for a moment, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially not in an environment that felt so hostile. Before I could answer, my mother interjected with a dismissive tone. "Oh, you know how he is, always so reserved. I'm sure everything's fine, right?" My sisters let out stifled giggles, and I felt like I was shrinking under their mockery, even in front of the only two people in the room who seemed to care about me. But my grandfather wasn't about to let it slide. "Reserved doesn't mean invisible or insignificant," he said firmly. "Maybe we should focus less on what's being said all the time and more on what's left unsaid." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked away awkwardly, while my father pretended to be engrossed in his phone. In that moment, I realized my grandfather was fed up with the family dynamic, tired of watching me be cast aside. From that day forward, he and my grandmother began to make me more of a priority. My grandfather started inviting me into his study more often, and our conversations grew deeper. He shared stories about his life, his business ventures, and, most importantly, the values of integrity and perseverance. "A person's character," he once told me, "isn't measured by what they have, but by what they do with it." One afternoon, as I helped my grandmother tidy up the garden, she took my hand and looked at me with a mix of tenderness and knowing. "You know you're special, right?" she said softly. "You're stronger than you think. And even though it doesn't feel like it now, good things come to those who work hard and stay true to themselves." That moment stayed with me, It was as if she saw something in me that I couldn't yet see for myself. What I didn't realize was that my grandparents were planning something that would change my life forever. Meanwhile, my situation at home remained the same. Dismissive parents, spoiled sisters, and the constant feeling of being an outsider. They continued to receive lavish gifts and live in luxury, while I remained overlooked. Yet, something inside me had shifted. I stopped craving their approval and began focusing on my goals. My visits to my grandparents became a source of strength, though I had no clue they were quietly laying the foundation for my future. The revelation came unexpectedly. We were at another family gathering at my grandparents' house, a routine event by now. After the meal, my grandfather stood up and asked for everyone's attention. "We've made some important decisions," he said with a gravity that silenced the room. My parents and sisters exchanged curious glances, but I noticed something different in his eyes, a determination I'd never seen before. "It's time to talk about the future," he said, and with those words, he set into motion a chain of events that none of us could have anticipated. The atmosphere in the room shifted completely with my grandfather's words. There was something in his tone that made it clear this wasn't just another announcement. Even though my parents and sisters tried to maintain a calm demeanor, I could see the curiosity, and perhaps a touch of anxiety, on their faces. As for me, I felt a mix of intrigue and a growing sense that something monumental was about to happen. My grandfather, standing beside my grandmother, looked each of us in the eye before continuing. "For years, we've watched this family evolve, seen how priorities and relationships have shifted. And I think it's time to make something very clear about what truly matters to us and what we want to leave behind." My mother let out a nervous chuckle, attempting to lighten the moment. "Well, Dad, we all know how important keeping the family together has always been to you. Isn't that what matters most?" But my grandfather didn't smile. His eyes remained steady as he responded, "Family unity means nothing if there's no respect and no real values holding it together." The weight of that statement hung heavy in the air. My mother shrank slightly in her chair. My sisters exchanged uneasy glances, and my father, predictably, avoided eye contact altogether, focusing on the tablecloth as if it were the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that my grandfather's words were aimed directly at me, as though he was trying to prepare me for something bigger. He went on, explaining that he and my grandmother had spent years considering how to handle the family's assets. He spoke of responsibility, hard work, and how today's choices shape tomorrow's outcomes. Then he paused, and the silence that followed was deafening. "What we've decided," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "is that the legacy we've built should go to someone who will value it, care for it, and use it wisely. This isn't about favoritism or automatic inheritance. It's about doing what's right." Then his eyes locked on mine. My heart raced. I could feel the weight of everyone else's stares boring into me, filled with disbelief and, in some cases, resentment. Before I could even begin to process what was happening, my grandfather continued, "That's why, after much thought, we've decided that my name will be the one to inherit our properties and resources when the time comes." The reaction was immediate. My mother gasped audibly, and one of my sisters nearly choked on the coffee she had been sipping. "What?" my older sister exclaimed, her voice dripping with a mix of outrage and disbelief. "That makes no sense. We've always been the ones closest to you, the ones who visit, the ones who take care of the little things." My grandfather raised a hand, silencing her with a calm but unyielding expression. "Do you really believe that? Because what I've seen are years of dismissiveness toward someone who has consistently shown effort, not for recognition, but because it's the right thing to do. And we value that more than any superficial gestures." The protests erupted immediately, my sisters speaking over one another in voices that grew increasingly shrill. My mother joined in, declaring this decision unfair and urging my grandfather to reconsider. But he stood his ground. "The decision is final," he stated with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. Amid the chaos, my grandmother spoke up. Her voice was soft but carried the same firmness as my grandfather's. "This isn't about dividing the family, though I understand some may see it that way. It's about recognizing someone who has shown humility, dedication, and a pure heart. And my name has demonstrated all of that and more. Time seemed to freeze. I was in shock, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. At the same time, a deep sense of validation and strength began to well up within me. But I couldn't ignore the glares of envy and hatred from my sisters, or the look of frustration etched across my mother's face. The rest of the evening was a whirlwind. The arguments continued, emotions ran high, and I was left grappling with the enormity of it all. Later, I retreated to my room at my grandparents' house, desperate for a moment of peace. That's when my grandfather came to find me. He sat beside me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "I know this won't be easy for you," he said, his voice calm yet filled with meaning. "But I want you to know that we trust you because we've seen what you're capable of. And while it might feel like a burden now, one day, you'll understand that this is an opportunity to make a real difference." I didn't know what to say. All I could do was nod, still trying to process everything. But deep down, I knew my life had just taken a dramatic turn, and from that moment on, I would have to face both the rewards and the challenges that came with this unexpected responsibility. The next family dinner was anything but peaceful. My mother, furious and on the verge of breaking down, completely avoided me, as though looking me in the eye was unbearable. My sisters, on the other hand, made no effort to hide their anger. Their passive-aggressive comments filled the air. "I hope you don't forget where you come from once you have all that money," my older sister said, her tone dripping with venom. The younger one, always more direct, chimed in. "Guess you won't have time for us now that you'll be so busy and important." Although their words stung, I tried to stay composed. There was something freeing about knowing I wouldn't give in to their manipulations this time, or to my mother's emotional games. But honestly, I wasn't prepared for what came next. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I overheard my sisters arguing in the living room. I couldn't resist listening from the stairs. "This can't go on," my older sister fumed. "It's ridiculous. Our whole lives, we've been told we'd inherit everything. Why is he getting it now, of all people?" The younger one responded with a hiss. "It's obvious they're punishing us, but this isn't over. What can we do to change their minds? Maybe if we ruin his reputation, they'll reconsider." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were actively plotting against me, trying to twist the situation in their favor. I felt a mix of rage and sadness. How had it come to this? All I wanted was peace in the family, but clearly, for them, it was never about love or unity. It was about greed and control. The next morning, my grandfather called me into his study. As soon as I shut the door behind me, he spoke with a seriousness I rarely saw. "I know this is hard for you," he began, "but you need to remember something. The real test isn't receiving something. It's handling how others react to it. Your sisters won't make this easy, and your parents probably won't either. But I believe you have the strength to handle what's coming." I nodded, feeling a mix of gratitude and responsibility. My grandparents had placed their trust in me, and I couldn't let my sisters' poison destroy what they wanted to build. Still, my patience was wearing thin. The days that followed turned into a battlefield. My sisters started spreading rumors among the extended family, claiming I had manipulated our grandparents into favoring me. My mother, always on their side, organized a lunch with close relatives, and without warning, the topic of the inheritance came up. "It's such a shame," my mother sighed theatrically, "that such an important decision was influenced by selfish interests." I couldn't stay quiet. Selfishness? Really, Mom? My whole life, I've gotten the leftovers while you've showered them with everything they wanted without question. And now I'm the manipulator? Maybe you should look in the mirror and ask why our grandparents think I'm the right one to handle this. The silence that followed was deafening. No one had expected me to respond so boldly, but I'd had enough. For the first time, I felt in control, like I didn't have to justify myself to anyone. After that lunch, tensions reached a boiling point, but something surprising started to happen. Some relatives who had kept their distance began reaching out to me. "You know, we've always admired your dedication and the way you care for your grandparents," one uncle told me. "Don't let the criticism get to you. You're doing the right thing." Slowly, I realized that not everyone in the family shared my sister's and mother's envy and resentment. The true test came a few weeks later when my grandparents invited everyone to a formal family gathering to finalize some legal matters. There, in front of everyone, my grandfather spoke with clarity and conviction. He explained that the inheritance wasn't just a gift or a reward, it was a responsibility. He detailed how he'd made his decision and made it clear that it wasn't about favoritism but trust. My sisters tried to interrupt, but my grandmother, in a rare show of authority, silenced them with a single look. "We've watched all of you for years," she said, "and what we see in my name is integrity, something we can't say about everyone here." That day, reality hit my sisters like a freight train. They tried to maintain their facade of indignation, but it was clear their battle was lost. For the first time in my life, I felt like I'd found my voice, that I didn't have to bear the weight of others' expectations and manipulations. That night, as I watched the sunset from my grandparents' garden, I felt a peace I'd never known before. I understood there was still a long road ahead, that resentments wouldn't disappear overnight. But I also knew that, for the first time, I was ready to face them. I wasn't the invisible one in the family anymore. Now, I was someone who could stand tall with the support of those who truly mattered. The day after that family meeting felt like waking up from a nightmare. It wasn't just the relief of having confronted my mother and sisters. It was something deeper, a sense of inner peace I'd never known before. But I also knew the story wasn't over. The wounds in the family, the simmering resentment, and the lingering envy wouldn't disappear overnight. Predictably, my sisters made one last desperate move. A few days later, I learned they'd consulted a lawyer, trying to find a way to contest my grandparents' decision. "It's unfair," they claimed. "All of this was done behind our backs." When I heard about it, I didn't know whether to laugh at their desperation or pity them. Did they not understand the problem wasn't the money, but their obsession with controlling everything? Still, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. While I wasn't looking for more conflict, I also wasn't about to let them destroy the legacy my grandparents entrusted to me. I went to speak with my grandparents privately, explaining the situation. My grandfather, always the firm yet fair man, looked at me with a mix of sadness and determination. "Let them do what they want," he said. "The truth always comes out in the end. What we've decided won't change." Even so, I couldn't shake the discomfort. The idea of spending my life in a legal battle with my own family made me sick. So, I decided to confront my sisters directly. I invited them to meet me at a cafe neutral ground, and when they arrived, with their usual smug attitudes, I made sure this conversation would be different. No shouting, no arguing. I looked them straight in the eye and said, "Are you really willing to destroy what little is left of this family over money? Because if you are, go ahead. But make no mistake, I'm not playing your game." My response seemed to catch them off guard. They exchanged nervous glances, searching for a strategy, but for once, they had nothing. Still, my eldest sister, always the more articulate one, tried to land a final blow. "This isn't just about money," she said. "It's about respect. You never had any. You were just the shadow in this family, and now suddenly you're the chosen one? It makes no sense." Her words hurt. I won't deny that. But this time, I didn't let them control me. "You're right," I said calmly. "I was never the favorite, never the one who had everything handed to them. But maybe that's exactly why I'm here now. Because I learned to value things, to work for them, and not to let envy consume me. If you want to keep this up, go ahead. But I won't waste my time or my peace." Walking out of that cafe felt like shedding a weight I'd carried for years. In the following days, my mother tried to mediate, calling me to guilt-trip me into compliance. But her words no longer held power over me. "What your grandparents are doing is wrong. They're tearing this family apart," she said in her usual dramatic tone. "Don't you care what you're doing to your sisters?" My answer was simple, "No, Mom. They did this to themselves." Over time, tensions began to cool. My sisters abandoned their legal battle, though resentment lingered in their eyes at family gatherings. My mother, still distant, seemed to accept that nothing would change. As for my grandparents, while saddened by how things unfolded, they constantly reassured me they'd made the right choice. The most surprising moment came months later when one of my aunts, someone I'd never been particularly close to, called to congratulate me. "I always knew you were different," she said. "And now, seeing how you've handled everything, I'm convinced your grandparents made the best decision. Don't let anyone bring you down." Her words filled me with strength. Gradually, I began investing the inheritance in projects that reflected the values my grandparents had always taught me: humility, hard work, and the importance of helping others. I established a foundation in their honor, dedicated to supporting talented young people who lacked the resources to pursue their dreams. Watching the impact of that work, the smiles of those it benefited, became one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Looking back now, I realized this journey wasn't about money or inheritance. It was about discovering who I truly am and breaking a toxic cycle that had ruled our family for generations. I didn't become who I am because of what I inherited, but because of how I chose to face the challenges that came with it. And while my relationship with my sisters and mother will never be the same, I've made peace with that. I've learned that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't material. It's the strength to stand firm in your beliefs, even when it feels like the whole world is against you.